All right, so my name is Daniel Stevens. I am the International Students Officer from the National Union of Students. This is me, if you didn't know. I used to be president of the student union here a long, long time ago. Kind of never left. I did my master's last year and was elected to be the national representative of international students in the UK. And I'm from Brazil, obviously you can tell by the accent, but I grew up in the States and lived also in Austria. So the speech I was asked to give today was, are we deterring international students? Yes. Any questions? No, thank you. Oh, you want more? Okay. Why? Maybe. Any questions? It's a bit simple. It's not rocket science. But I think I'll go into some details and look at the numbers. So first, let's talk about international students and numbers. So in the UK, you have 435,000 international students if you include EU. Now, if you break that down and you look at non-EU, it's 300,000. Of those, it's 124,000 undergraduate, 124,000 postgraduate, and about 30,000 on postgraduate research courses. International students make up 17% of all students in higher education institutions. In some places, it's larger. So if you look at London, it's about 25%. If you look at Scotland, it's about 21%. And these are huge numbers when you think of some institutions. So for example, Manchester, 11,235 international students. Here at Warwick, 8,200 international students. UCL is about 9,000. LSE, 67% of all the students there are international. So these are large, huge numbers for universities. Now, student visas issued. In 2009, there were 310,000 student visas issued. Today, there's 197,000. So, I mean, you can see that this is an incredible drop. What does that actually mean for the university sector? So, higher education stats. The first time ever for like 15 years, first-time enrollments for international students were down by 0.5%. A UK survey this year found that the numbers were down by about 2%. So international student numbers haven't declined in the higher education sector. We'll go back to why you see that large drop in the last slide. But within the university sector, it's completely static. It hasn't changed at all. And you have to compare this to other countries, and you have to compare this to the growth of international students worldwide to realize that this is practically a cut in real terms. And actually, when you look at this number, it hides what's really happening. Because the number of international students coming to study in the UK hasn't decreased, but the composition has. So essentially, Chinese students are propping up the system, because you're seeing an increase of students from China, but a decrease from students from from our large, broad spectrum, especially in India. So the number of Chinese students coming to the UK has increased from about 67,000 to 78,000. A number of Indian students have declined from 39,000 to 29,000. Huge drop, 10,000 students. So you can see the really nice trajectory of higher education. Big increases, big increases, big increases. Visa changes come in, and then that. Compare this to the other world. Now you can't really read this, but I'll read some excerpts of it. This is from the Canadian government website, and this is from the Immigration Minister. This is what he's saying. It's a press release from the Immigration Minister in Canada. Now you have to keep in mind, like I want you to imagine Theresa May and Damien Green when you're reading this. So he's saying this press release is celebrating that for the first time Canada has over 100,000 international students, and celebrating the fact that international students are coming to Canada. And he says that attracting and retaining the brightest investors from across the world is part of the government's commitment to grow Canada's economy and ensure long-term prosperity. And it's about 2 pages of how fantastic international students are. I mean, could you imagine the UK, Theresa May or Damien Green saying this? So the actual political climate is completely different in the UK compared to some of the big competitor countries like the United States, or Canada, or Australia. So this is Theresa May. She is the Home Secretary. And some of the language that she uses. So she said, abuse of the student route in an industrial scale. Introduction of 100,000 credibility interviews. So the government rhetoric is completely different in lots of countries. So just that is enough to deter international students. So what about the other sectors? So we've seen that 100,000 decline in the drop in student visas. Now, if you break that down, independent schools have seen a decline of 17%. Language schools, on those that are coming for more than 1-year courses, 76% drop. FE sector, 67% drop in student visas. And then Study UK, which represents like the independent sector in private schools, has about a drop of 70% in applications. So HE sector is kind of steady. The private sector, independent sector have been completely wiped out, essentially. So what's there left to talk about? So you've seen the numbers. So I'm going to try to give you a history as to why international students are being deterred, provide some of the context, give the political context, and then kind of explain what things in the current system are really driving international students nuts. So I've been here quite long enough. So I came here in 2006 and arrived in 2000, and I've been here since then. I've seen the system completely change. So since 2006, you've had visa fees increasing. You've had the introduction of the points-based system, which introduced things like academic monitoring, which we'll talk about. You've had the introduction of biometrics, which was kind of a shock. So I came here in 2006. I reapplied for a visa in 2010. They're like, oh no, you have to get your fingerprints taken and carry an ID card with you. So main changes in the current system from 2009 to 2012. So in 2008, you had the introduction of the points-based system. 2010, you had the elections, which brought the conservative government into power. 2011, you had the removal of the post-study work visa. 2012, you had London Met. And now you've had the establishment of credibility interviews. So 2009, implementation of the points-based system. So the points-based system was introduced on the 31st of March. And it shifted, so the reason it was introduced is before you had what was called entry clearance officers. So if you wanted to come to the UK, you had to go to an entry clearance officer, and they would look at all your applications, and they would make the decision as to whether you were allowed in the country. But the problem is they were making academic decisions. They weren't like making legitimate decisions. So essentially, one of the stories I had was that in like a foreign embassy or overseas post, there was within like the embassy a room, and that room was meant for music students or performance students to perform or play their instrument for an entry clearance officers to show they were a legitimate student. It's absurd. So this completely shifted the burden onto of compliance into telling the borders that these were legitimate students. But the problem is it essentially shifts a lot of the costs. So LLC estimates that it's spending about £250,000 a year just in some of the compliance costs alone. 2010, you had the electoral debates. I don't know if you guys remember this. They tried to Americanize the UK elections. It was terrible. It was just pretty awful. Great job, BBC. But one of the phrases that the conservatives used was that they wanted to reduce net migration from the hundreds of thousands to the tens of thousands. And they were talking about this for a while. I mean, they were talking about some ridiculous proposals for students. So one conservative wanted students to put a bond when they come to the UK that they only get back when they return to their home country. And a backbencher went further and said, no, we should withhold their degree certificates and only give them their degrees when they go back home. Yeah. So they want to reduce net migration from the hundreds of thousands to the tens of thousands. Universities want to increase the number of students coming in because they see this trajectory. The big problem is that if you actually look at net migration in the UK, you can't really read this, but the big giant block is study. So net migration, the reason there is huge net migration is just because there's lots of students coming. And so the only way you can meet that electoral target is to cut down on the number of international students, which is essentially what the government is trying to do, even though they like to say there's no cap. So they came in, introduced a raft of new changes. So this was the removal of post-study work opportunities. They said that you can only bring your dependents with you if you're doing a postgraduate course or above. They said if you're in the independent sector, you have no working, or a private sector, you have no working rights at all. And they introduced lots of changes to make the system more complex and tighter. And then you had 2012. Now this was an article in the Sunday Times saying that the Home Office was going to revoke the license of London Metropolitan University. This was the 28th of August. Much to the surprise of London Mets, who didn't know that the Home Office was going to revoke the license of London Metropolitan University, and learned about this from this news article. And that triggered a giant mess. So this story was leaked in the Sunday Times. The next day it was formally denied by ministers. And then the day after that, 8 p.m., a statement went up on the UKVA's website saying the license was going to be revoked. It was quite sneaky the way they did this, because they published this at the same time as the opening ceremony of the Paralympics, like virtually the exact same time. And so I think they were trying to get this sneaked in. So they thought, okay, we'll just revoke this license and no one's going to notice, and it's fine if we move on to our lives. Of course, that wasn't the case. There were protests, and there's national media seen across the entire world. Lots of different things. I won't go into too much detail about London Max, so we'll talk about this for an hour. But eventually there was a court hearing, and a judge said, which I feel like is ridiculous, these students should be able to stay at London Max and finish their degrees, at least until the end of the year. Not content, Theresa May has announced that she's going to introduce face-to-face interviews to all international students wanting to come to the UK. And say there's about 100,000 that are going to be rolled out this year. So those were the same. So those are all the big changes that have been introduced, and the big changes that are deterring international students. So what's the political landscape? It's essentially the Home Office versus everyone. So BIS, we think, are secretly want to take international students out of these net migration statistics. And unprecedentedly, 5 parliamentary committees, including the BIS Select Committee and the Home Affairs Select Committee, have come out saying that international students should be taken out of net migration figures. CBI, IOD, basically everyone in the education sector. But what are the problems? So, okay, right. In terms of the political realism of the situation, June 2012 showed net migration at 162,000. And so this was largely driven by the fall of student visas. It's at 163,000 now. The general election is at 2015. How far do you think the Conservatives are willing to go to be able to say that they met their manifesto pledge, to be able to have that soundbite to say that they reduced net migration from the hundreds of thousands to the tens of thousands like they said they would? That's the scary thought. And so you're seeing like this rise of UKIP and the government rhetoric. You're seeing a shift in public perceptions towards international students. Australia recently published a study which showed that everyone there basically loved international students. International students were a great thing. If you did that study in the UK, I'm not sure if you'd get the same response. I think that's partially driven to the fact that people in government keep saying that there's bogus students, that there's bogus colleges, that there's huge, large amounts of abuse. And so people think there is. So people think there is a large problem. When in reality, if you look at it, it's quite small. And the abuse is quite minimal. And so now they're trapped in a situation where they can't step back and say, look, no, international students are a good thing, because they've built up this problem for so long. And of course, the other problem is if at this stage they say, okay, right, we're going to take international students out of net migration figures, the Labour Party has a chance, has an opportunity to shift to the right and jump the Conservatives in the whole immigration debate. You've seen this. So this week, Yvette Cooper made a speech in which she actually said, oh, the net migration target is wrong, which is good, should be applauded. But then she said, the real abuse is in the short-term student visas. What evidence do you have? There's been not a single study to suggest that there's been abuse in that system. So you're seeing it's kind of like immigration is still being treated as a political football for both parties. So I'm going to just quickly go through the actual impact. So what's going to happen? So there is going to be an impact, even though the current sector in terms of numbers is static. You have to consider the whole higher education system and the education system in the UK as a pipeline. So you have students going from language schools, who might then go to high school here in the UK, who might then go to a pre-sessional course, who then goes to university. So you're seeing large drops in numbers in the beginning of the pipeline. And I'll give you an example. So I've heard people that work in China and worked in Chinese schools to suggest that Chinese students, as early as 13 or 14, are now going to schools that prepare them for the American system instead, whereas they used to go to schools that prepare them for the British system. So they're already changing the entire way they're going through this pipeline just because of these visa rules. And so you're going to see, I think, an impact along the line. And there's a huge, I'm not going to talk about the economic impact of international students because it's quite straightforward, but a study came out this week that showed that the net benefit of the 8,000 international students studying in Sheffield was £120 million per year. And that's when you consider all the costs they might have to public services, everything. Right, so where's the big problem? I'm gonna pull up the HEFCE, which is the Higher Education Funding Council of England figures on international students. Now HEFCE, in a recent study, forecasted a growth of 37% from international students in 3 years' time. They said we expect that in the sector, the income from international student fees would rise, 37%, which is impossible at this stage, because the numbers are static. Can't really see this, but this is non-EU HE fees. Now, universities get 11.7% of their income from international students. It's a huge chunk of money. So just quickly talk about what's happening in terms of universities now with compliance. This is quite technical but quite important. So universities have something which is called their highly trusted sponsor status. It's what London Met lost. If you lose your license, you can no longer teach those international students. And those international students receive letters saying they have 60 days to go to an institution or leave the country. Now, the way you keep or lose this license is based on numbers. So if a certain number of international students don't show up to lectures, or a certain number of international students, you have your visas rejected, you can lose that license. So what's the problem? Universities have become completely paranoid that they're going to lose this license. And so they've implemented ranges of complicated, convoluted systems to ensure they can keep this, much to the detriment of international students. So institutions have implemented really severe attendance monitoring procedures. If you were a student at Coventry University, up until a certain point, you would have to report to a registry every single day with your ID card to show you were at that institution, outside of classrooms. Similarly, at UEL, if you miss 3 classes, you're pretty much kicked out. And in some institutions, like maybe once a month, or maybe once every 2 weeks, you have to come to a registry and show your passport and show your visa just to say you're still studying, which is quite ridiculous when you consider it. Now, some institutions are going even further and implementing really complicated, stupid procedures. So Newcastle University investigated the possibility of having a biometric monitoring system. The idea being that you put your fingerprint every time you go into a lecture theater. I've heard I've heard an institution. Someone had said to me an institution is looking into introducing a key fob. Does anyone know what a key fob is? It's quite scary. It's essentially a keychain with a GPS. The idea being the international student would have that keychain, and so you could tell if he was going into campus or not. And it's completely changing the nature of education. Because I don't know about you, when I came here, sometimes you miss like 3 lectures at a time. You just go, I want to go on vacation. Why not? And you can't do that anymore. And it's just the idea that you're treated as an independent adult at a university is being undermined because of the way institutions are trying to respond to this UKBA agenda. Right, so this is some of the work that NUS has done this year. We've done a lot of work on visa delays, especially for post-study work visas over the last summer. We intervened in the London Met case. We've done a lot in terms of raising awareness of police registration. There used to be huge, long lines for students in London. One of the things we campaigned on, we got this video online, we managed to overturn that. We're now working on large visa delays. So if you're an international student, you can wait up to 4 or 5 months for your visa if you make an application in the country to extend it. So in terms of what's wrong with the current system, there's 2 things. I won't go into too much detail. There's the actual government policy side of things, the rights that international students have, and there's the actual implementation of those policies. So quickly, in terms of the government policy, it's things like making it difficult for more post-study work opportunities. It's things like the general government rhetoric and how they portray international students in the media. It's the whole package of how the UK is like treating and government policy is treating international students. Now, in terms of the actual implementation of the policy, does anyone know what this is? Anyone? It's an ancient, it's an artifact from like the time of dinosaurs. Yeah, this is a fax machine. Now, why is there a fax machine in this presentation? Does anyone know? All right, so if you want to send an attachment to someone, usually you just attach an email. Attach a PDF, attach a PowerPoint, that's fine. If If you want to send an attachment to the UKVA, you have to fax them. All right, now I say this because this is like, summarizes everything that's wrong with the current system, is the fact that the UKVA is this large, bureaucratic, incompetent mess of a system, which I can only imagine is a black hole of money. Really, so in the current system, you have huge, long delays, absolutely long delays. So if you put in an application, it takes 4 or 5 months for it to be processed. You have no consistency. So you might have someone that's really nice to you and favors you, and unless you have that, like, gives you a chance. You might have someone that you can't contact you. And there's no information, so this is what I like to call the Domino's problem, right? So if you order like a 5-pound pizza from Domino's, you will know exactly where your application, your pizza is, the entire stage of your, order. If you give your passport and 500 pounds to the UKVA, you have no idea where the hell it is, and you can't even ask until 6 months have passed. So yeah, I put Nat West here because if you're an international student, one of the things that you have to do is you have to collect bank statements to show that you have a certain amount of money for your application. Now this is a big nightmare, and I was in Northampton yesterday, and I was talking to international students, and one of them said, yeah, I had this huge problem with bank statements. I was like, Nat West? I was like, yeah. This is what international students do. When we get together, we share war stories at the UKVA. So I had to make an application, and like a good student, of course, I was making it the last week before my visa expired. And I had to get my bank statements. And so I went to NatWest, and I was like, can I have my bank statements shown, for the last 3 weeks? They're like, yeah, sure, okay. I printed it out. And I was like, okay, can you stamp it? Because the UKVA, you have to have it stamped. And they said, no. I was like, what? Again? No, we changed our policy 2 days ago. So there I was, facing deportation in the face. And essentially what I did is I went to 12 different NatWest branches, hoping to find someone that didn't know this policy existed. Managed it. Thank God. I felt like I won the lottery when I actually got that stamp. Which is stupid. It's the problem is that they give you no leeway in your applications. Absolutely no leeway. So you can't write a cover letter saying, look, NatWest is really trying to screw me over. They don't accept it. So NUS has launched a new campaign called Give the Home Office the Yellow Card. I do encourage you to help. So if you go onto our website, you can find it. This automatically sends a letter to Theresa May and your local MP asking for better system for international students. So thank you very much for listening to me rant for half an hour. Yeah. And any questions?
What do you think can be done to kind of change that anti-international student culture that we currently have in the UK?
I think the benefits of international students has to be better articulated. So that's one of the reasons the Sheffield report is so exciting, is that you start making about jobs, you start making about the local community, and you basically say, once you explain the benefits to international students, I think people will be much more receptive. And so when you start talking about the benefit of international students, especially from a constituency to constituency basis, you have a much more powerful argument. But I think one of the big thing is just continuously challenging the government to be careful with its rhetoric. Because that's where it lies. It's just because you keep hearing these sound bites in the media and in the Daily Mail or the Telegraph, which is just creating this terrible culture. Yeah.
Well, do you think that EU students are sometimes in the squeezed middle of the international students that are? Because on the one hand, they're not home students and they're not bound by the government's regulations, but on the other hand, they're not paying the nice and attractive fees of non-EU international students. And as a result, they get discriminated against.
I guess so. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Although I think the counter-argument to that is you're still paying things at accommodation. You're still paying things, you're still paying huge amounts of money into local stores. Even with that, when you buy a sandwich or prep, that's still export. And so there's still an economic argument even with that. Any questions? Yes.
What do you think can be done on the grassroots level to kind of organise people behind this campaign on campus?
The students union will probably, hopefully, send an email to everyone. And so when that email is sent, you can just share it on Facebook or Twitter If they haven't, you can go to James's office and Ben's office and ask why. Yes?
So a couple of things you talked about were policies and then the actual implementation of those policies. And a lot of those policies come from sort of a cultural and generational divides. And I'm wondering what your opinion is, since this is about forecasting. For example, I'm from Mexico, and my the UK VA visa is processed in Bogota, Colombia. So it goes all the way to Colombia to process, so there are all these policy implementations. But I'm curious, what do you think is going to happen, say, amongst, say, digital natives or sort of post-national ideologies, right? Do you think how's that going to impact, say, with younger generations, as yourself you mentioned, having problems with nationalist ideas, in-out groups, you know? So I'm just curious to see 25 years from now, maybe 12 years from now, what do you think is going to happen sort of when can we move away from frictionless nationalist ideas that allow you to essentially come and go as you please? Because you're talking about those policies, so I see it as a cultural idea, but at least people around my age, through social networks like Couchsurfing, Airbnb, so there's this idea that we are free to move about the world, and is that a generational change, and how do you think that'll change policy maybe down the road? It's kind of a big question, but I'm just curious to see what your opinion is about that.
No, it's a really fantastic question, actually. I think, I do think just because you look at everyone, their experiences they have at the universities, they have much more contact with other international students, they have much more contact with the outside world because of the internet and everything like that. I can't say if I know how that'll change policies, but I do hope it will. But yeah, it's a good thought. But I can't respond to it in any shape or form. Yeah.
How do you think Warwick compares to other universities in the UK as an international university, and what lessons can we learn from some of the other universities that you have experience from?
Depends how many members of staff are here. Warwick is a fantastic international university. Every student is an international student. No, actually Warwick is quite fantastic in its outlook, and actually in trying to really promote a truly international agenda. I mean, I've worked with the international office, and they've been quite receptive. And I think one of the good things about Warwick is, compared to other institutions, is that internationalization is enforced. Because if you look at Cambridge, you look at Oxford, you look at some of the older institutions, they have their traditions, they have their norms. They have kind of like 1,000 years of history. Whereas Warwick has always been quite quick on its feet. And so for internationalization for Warwick, I think is about trying to establish an identity it never had. It's kind of like the anti-university. So it's a bit easier, I think, than having like an institution that's been around for 600 years, internationalized. Because as Alex well said, sometimes the internationalization agenda is based on just trying to get more international students in the door, not necessarily looking at the kind of actual academic experience. Yes.
Hi, Daniel. I just wonder whether you think, based on your work at the moment, there is scope in terms of having a benefit, in terms of more collaboration with university vice chancellors and, say, NUS on this subject. At the moment, see, I think what's happening out there is that there's a lot of work behind the scenes. So work going around campuses and like right now, but no one is listening in the public media. I mean, because so in some sense it's about, I don't want to say it, but you know, even to the extent where you're joining forces in a way that the whole community sees, peaceful protests. There's been no peaceful protests on this issue for the last 5 years. So in some sense, as far as the government is concerned, nothing is happening, business as usual, and we will pursue and lead the agenda. So I guess it's about taking some action. You know, there's a long-term issue which was raised, which is leave that aside. In the short term, the next 5, 10 years, let's say, and you want to speed up progress in the right direction. I'm just wondering, shouldn't one be taking more concrete action to influence the politicians and who at the end of the day have to make decisions
I think
which
you
direction?
have to look at the incentives. So I think certainly NUS would be more than willing to do anything quite public, anything that's front facing.
Well, not anything. Yeah.
But not anything. But it's more, I think, from certainly from like the mission groups or the representative groups from the university sector. The problem is they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to create a self-fulfilling prophecy, essentially, because if you do a big public campaign on this, and if you do make that noise, that gets picked up in China, that gets picked up in India, that gets picked up in the world press. And so even though they're fighting for international students, from their kind of recruitment perspective, they're helping to shoot themselves in the foot. So they're kind of, I think they do want to do as much things behind the scenes. They don't want to do anything front-facing just because they're worried about what impact they'll have on recruitment.
Just following on from that, I think it's also, in terms of challenging that, sort of that wider discourse about sort of international students and linking that to immigration and sort of as Dan was saying, in terms of sort of that, is such a big national political issue that unless we're able to sort of counter that wider discussion about international students are bad, then actually we're never going to be able to change the policies. And I think in terms of being able to change that wider perception, it's going to be much more even than just student unions and vice chancellors. Actually, in a sense, it would be very easy to say, as indeed the press do, they would say that, wouldn't they? But actually, what I think was so good about particularly the Sheffield piece of work earlier this week was that actually it wasn't just the university and the student union, it was the local council, it was local businesses, actually reaching out and being able to demonstrate the widest possible impact of what international students bring to a local community beyond just the economic. So actually being able to sort of win that, that wider public debate and actually sort of start to change perceptions outside universities more generally, and I think that's when we'll actually start to win that wider debate.
All right, I'm going to end it here because I think I'm running over time. But no, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. And yeah, any questions, just come find me. I'll be here all day.